of snow break, so I'm glad we're able to be back together and kind of continue our time through the Roman world. Having the last 2 weeks off, it did cause me to pause and say, where did we leave off? It's been a little too long thinking about where we've been, but I did remember. So this morning we're going to be looking at the role of women in the Roman world. The last time we were together a couple weeks ago, we looked at the role of males in the Roman world, kind of their the understanding of how Romans conceived of males and kind of the genetic philosophical makeup. And today we're going to kind of look at the inverse of that, kind of the sad kind of underside in some ways of some of those themes that we looked at a couple weeks ago. Just to kind of recap, in case you weren't here, or it's been a while and the snow has, eviscerated our memories. The Romans believed that the male body genetically was superior to female. So they believed all babies were born male and then became female through the lack of heat. If you remember that kind of weird discussion, right? Right, the baby was not in the oven long enough, right? And so they view, sadly, women as a kind of a defect from the kind of male perfection. As we mentioned a few weeks ago, obviously the logical fallacy with that is you kind of need that for the system, right? If you're going to have subsequent generations. So there definitely were flaws in the logic of the argument, but that did not stop Roman men from, saying it, right? And so that's kind of where we're going to begin with this conception of Roman men as the perfection that led to different educational and philosophical commitments that we're going to see today, and then different roles for women in the Roman world because of that. So when we think about the role of women, we actually can look at a text. I'm going to read it because it's a little small and hard to read. But this text comes from one of a Roman governor in Bithynia. His name's Pliny. He writes to the Emperor Trajan. Fun fact for Christians, right? He's the one that mentions the persecution of Christians underneath the reign of Trajan. But this is a very different context. He's talking to one of his friends about his daughter. And so I want us to see kind of how women are described. And it actually uses 3 key terms that we actually want to look at. So let me read it aloud for us, since I'm a little closer. Although she had not yet reached the age of 14, she had the intelligence of an old woman, the dignity of a matron, the sweetness of a girl, together with the modesty of a maiden. How she used to hang from her father's neck, how affectionately and modestly she used to embrace us who were her father's friends, her nurses, her minders, and teachers, how she respected each of them according to their duty. With what care and intelligence she used to read, how sparingly and with what restraint she played. And you're thinking, okay, that's an interesting quote, but it actually gives us a lot of data for how at least Pliny is viewing one of his friend's daughters. And this, of course, is an upper elite Roman daughter, not your average everyday Roman. But the terms that he uses to describe her are actually rather significant. He says at the beginning, she had the dignity of a matron, the sweetness of a girl, and the modesty of a maiden. These 3 terms actually are rather important for how we think about the roles of women in the ancient world. The first one is the term puella. This was used for girls until they were about 12 years old, before the onset of puberty, essentially. And that's kind of the first stage of life. You are a puella, you are a young girl. Then you become a virgo, which is basically the onset of puberty, which means we're able to have kids now. And then the final stage was a matrona, and this singled out that someone was married, but more than that, the matrona was someone awaiting motherhood. So the reason why I kind of start with this quote is it really gives us in many ways the kind of life arc, if you will, of Roman women. You are a puella, and then you are a virgo, and then you are a matrona. That's kind of the horizon of landscape of roles that you are going to encounter. And if you notice, those are pretty clearly defined, right? You're a young girl, you're a girl waiting to be married, and then you're a married woman waiting to become a mother. And that really is the kind of life stages that all Roman women would have been encountering in their lives. They're either waiting to be married or waiting to be a mother. And that's kind of the art there. The term Virgo is a little bit different than how we use it today. Obviously our term virgin comes from that in Latin. It means something a little bit more than that. It's really the ready to be married, i.e. ready to start having children. And we'll see how that segues here in a minute. Interestingly enough, the term Virgo was never applied to males in the Roman world. You will not find a single Roman text where a Roman teenage boy is ever actually considered a Virgo or even recommended to be a Virgo. In fact, we find the opposite evidence in Roman texts actually encouraging them to not be Virgos. So it's a very gendered double standard there. Yeah?
I just wanted to go over this fact. Did you say that you described this young woman as somebody who could read?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So that's fantastic
Yep.
in and of itself that they thought women were worthy of being taught to read.
Yeah, so when I share this quote with students, sometimes our views of the ancient world can be kind of stereotypical, and the past is just complicated. So this young woman is praised for her intelligence. She is praised for reading, things we might not assume ancient women would be praised for. But again, the ancient world is complicated. It's not entirely everything that we would hope for, but there are some little interesting exceptions there. So she probably has the educational training because of the economic status of her family. That's probably one element that's playing into this. We'll see later on that education in many ways, women are educated. The question is for what purpose? The purpose is not usually a job or a career. It's usually so that they can be a great conversation partner at dinner parties with their husband, right? So they can talk with the topics that their husbands are talking about, not necessarily for their own kind of upbringing, but for their roles in society, be an educated person. But we'll talk about education here in a little bit. So yeah, Virgo is the next stage. Then you're going to be married, and then you become a mother-in-waiting. You are a matrona. Your clothes would actually change. You'd wear different togas, essentially. Typically, if you're a Virgo, you'd wear like a stripe over it just to indicate, one, that you are available to be, potentially a mate, and two, so that you make sure that you're not hitting on a married woman, right? So if you're a Roman man, you want to figure out who's wearing what, so you know who's out there, because nothing more awkward, right, than obviously potentially hitting on a married woman. So it actually would dress different. I want us to see this arc of horizon because I want to interact with that a little bit later on with some of the commands that we see from Paul, particularly on marriage, and more specifically on singleness. I think we're going to come to see a very interesting interaction with this list. But these three terms really begin to define that kind of horizon. This is as girls grow up. This is what they're looking at as those stages of their life.
Jason,
yeah.
Quick question. As it relates to Mary, who is described as betrothed but not yet married to Joseph,
yeah.
In key nativity text,
yep.
Can you just explain how that sort of intermediate stage between Virgo and Matrona fits with Mary?
Yeah, so I think at the stage we meet Mary in the Gospels, if this is the Roman conception of it, but if you wanted to map it on the Jewish world, it would be a Virgo. So she is ready to be married, essentially. So, but you get that title, the betrothment would be just a kind of a temporary step onto Matrona, which they would recognize as a distinct stage, but in terms of her ascent, she's still in the Virgo category because she's not yet married. So it's kind of just that little preamble to marriage. But quickly she would become a Matrona as soon as she was married.
And was that a Jewish custom to have this intermediate phase where Virgo kind of moves closer to being a Matrona, or was there an equivalent within the rest of the Roman world?
That's a really good question. So Roman marriage practices are a little bit different. They have everything from essentially common law marriage to just most Roman marriage is just two people agreeing that they want to be living together. Sometimes you don't even need a ceremony. And so I would argue maybe the Jewish process, I'm a little more unfamiliar with that, might be a little bit more defined. But then Romans do have marriage ceremonies that you can go down to a temple and kind of get a blessing. And then you could register with the state, and we'll see why that's important later. There are tax benefits to being married in the Roman Empire, very similar to our tax benefits. Some things never change. And so, yeah, so there are differences between the two ways that they're conceiving of that. And the Romans aren't going to force their social customs on marriage onto the Jews. They would allow them to run their own practices in their own, at least in ancient Israel. Now, if you're in, I guess, the diaspora, that might be a little bit more interesting question on where you would land. But yeah, this would be that typical arc. But you're always merging towards Matrona. So the stages of life for women are very, very different. So typically, well, for all babies would be inspected upon birth for any sort of physical deformities. Very similar to what we do today, right? When a baby's born, they get whisked off to the doctor. Here it's a midwife, right? And they're checking the digits, they're checking the crying, they're checking the various things. Sadly, in the ancient world, right, any form of disability would usually be a cause for abandonment, essentially. You can imagine, even today, right, it's very difficult in many ways, and we've come a long way, right, with ramps and other ways of the ADA Act, right, which still is helpful but doesn't solve all of our problems. Imagine going back 2,000 years. Children's being born with disabilities is a very, very tough road. And so sadly, many of those children were left for abandonment. We actually have a text. This comes from Egypt, from a papyri. And this is a soldier writing back to his wife. Clearly, he's not going to be there for the pregnancy. You'll get that in a minute. But this is kind of one of the brutal realities. So he says, I ask and entreat you to take care of the child, and if I receive my pay soon, I will send it. Above all, if you bear a child and it is male, let it be. But if it is female, cast it out. And so that's kind of his estimation, because the Roman male controls the household. And so he is saying if it's a female, essentially we don't want it. And so cast it out means you would just leave it to either the elements, which is very, very sad if you think about it. Most often, children would not pass away that way. They typically would sadly be picked up by slave traders and enslaved. And so women into usually some form of sexual slavery, and men to work fields, houses, like that. So it's one of those kind of brutal realities of the Roman world where they're just abandoning children. It's usually called infanticide in the ancient world. And early Christians are going to interact with this in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. It actually starts some of the first orphanages that we see in the Roman world, which is picking up children off of abandonment places, actually raising them as their own. And so that's a really interesting way that the Christians started to interact with this pretty brutal reality. And so as children are inspected, right, they're made sure to see that they're healthy, at least as far as people can tell. And then on day 8, they would get a name. So Roman babies are named on day 8. But we even see a gender difference here. So if you're a Roman male, you're going to have 3 names. You're going to have the name that your parents gave you. You're going to have an honorific title in the middle, honoring some member of your family or some other honorific title, and then your kind of last name, your surname, right? So Roman men get 3 names. Roman women do not. They actually will just take the name of their father. So a female would just get a feminine version of the male name. So if your name is Julius, like Julius Caesar, you'd be called Julia. That's your name. There's no really debate about it. And then you might be asking, what if you have more than one daughter? Well, they get very creative. They don't get a second name. They get called Julia the Second, or Julia the Third, or if you have 2, Julia the Elder and Julia the Younger. And so, like, the kind of misogyny goes all the way down. They're giving boys 3 names, and girls are just like, name them after their father. So they don't get really any distinct name there. And so the naming actually reveals, again, just the social value of what they're doing. They did celebrate birthdays, this is just a fun fact in the Roman world. Largely because, as we mentioned maybe a few weeks ago, the infant mortality rate is very high. It is around 50, only 50% of children will make it to age 10. And then within the first year of life, 60% of children often die. So birthdays are actually a pretty big deal in the Roman world, just because you made it one more turn around the sun, right? And that's something to celebrate. So they would have cakes, they'd have special clothes, they'd have gifts. And I highlight that because there's just some things about being human across time that tend to stay, right? We want to celebrate various things in our life. And so these stages would then come to reflect different kind of social values. And so it just showcases just some of the differences. This is the Temple of Saturn. This is where if you were in Rome, you would take your baby's name and kind of place it in the temple as a blessing. So just showing the interaction of Roman religion and the social world kind of go hand in hand. We have gods for different aspects of childbirth, and so you would kind of go back to the temple and give a kind of an honorific gift for a safe delivery, especially given how many women and children die in childbirth. The gods were, quote unquote, also involved with that process, right? And we'll look at that a little bit later as well. So these stages of Puella, Virgo, and Matrona then come to start in. And so one of the very interesting things we find is how do we socialize women in the Roman world to these roles? We actually have some really interesting examples. So what you see on the screen a little bit, we have found throughout numerous burial chambers, burial plots of Roman women. And you might think that this is a doll. It's actually not. It's not like a Barbie doll. It kind of looks like that. But this comes from an actual woman. I believe she was found in Egypt, if I remember right, when I made this. Her name is Cryperia Tryphena. It's on her sarcophagus. And she's buried with this, and it has little clothes attached to it, and sometimes depending on the social income of the family, different jewels or rings that you would put on it. So you're already thinking Barbie doll, but it's not that. Because these are buried with women who die young, around 20 years old. They're being buried with these things. And what we think is that these are socialization tools, and so they would actually begin to work with young girls, either through the life stage development of how their bodies are developing, or with what roles they'll be taking on. So they're like educational tools to help them talk about the roles of mother, the roles of being working in the home. And when you get married, you actually give up these dolls. There's actually a ceremony where you set them aside because now you're becoming a matrona. But it shows us that the ways that the Romans talked about being a woman were actually very practical. It was in the home, it was educating what their next stages of life would look like. And so these are, again, not baby dolls, but rather mature dolls. They're adults, the doll's age, right? To show them various aspects of the stages that are to come. But we find these all over the place, of differing qualities depending on the level of income of the family, from kind of very basic elements to very elaborate ones. And it just shows that the Romans were interested in not just allowing people just to develop how they would develop. There was a socialization into this is what a Roman woman ought to be. And that is the mother's job to teach with the women. And so this just shows us some of the similarities and differences from growing up. We're going to look a little bit more at the ways that women were pictured in the Roman world. So there is an idealized woman. If you've ever gone to a museum and seen a sculpture, that's putting forth an image of what at least Roman men sculptors wanted their women to look like. So they're projecting an image of conformity. And I'm going to show us some pictures. So Romans preferred their women to have their hair kind of tied back behind their head, almost like in a bun. And this is different from Greeks that would cover. So we don't have a lot of head coverings in the Roman world. Only in particular worship contexts will we see that. And it actually intersects with a little bit of what Paul said in 1 Corinthians about wearing head coverings. That's a very Roman style of doing that. But Roman women did not cover their heads, unlike Greek women. So they liked it tied back. Their hairstyles would, in many ways, follow the emperor's wife. It sounds kind of really simple, but whatever haircut she gets, you would then see that kind of replicated through the empire. Because everyone wants to have the same haircut as Livia, for example. And so they adapt that to her. Togas would go all the way to the ground. You can kind of see that in this picture. I joke with students, no ankles, please, right? Very, very scandalous. And so they go all the way flowing to the ground. Again, if you are in the Virgo category, you would wear some sort of staple to kind of signify that, because we'll see how that's going to become important later on. But again, obviously very modest dress, very modest hairstyles, but projecting some essence of Roman beauty, right, standards. So this becomes the ways in which women think about their own lives and their own image. And this comes to affect how they dress in public, what they wear. Hair becomes an interesting focus of obsession in some ways, because it's a way to, one, show off fertility. So Roman hair, for many different reasons, was viewed as being able to be very fertile. So the more hair you have, the longer, the more luxurious. That's sending a signal to other Roman men. It was also a way to show off wealth. So many elaborate hairstyles would have jewels and various elements in them. I've actually seen this reflected in the New Testament, in 1 Peter, in James, and in certain Pauline letters, of not having hair that is adorned, because it was a way to show off, kind of show social status. In certain cultures today, right, that still is very true, right? Some hairstyles are very, very expensive to keep up, and it was a way in the Roman world to show off your wealth. And so when we come to Paul's communities, it is not another just social differentiation that Paul seems to be working against. And so some of his comments on women's hair sometimes seem like, what's Paul doing? But it's more of the social impact of that, because it's signaling to people some degree of wealth in the community. And Paul seems to have a more egalitarian perspective on that. We want everyone to be looked at and treated the same. So sometimes he tries to level that playing ground there. So this is the ways in which women would be adorned. In this landscape, we have that term Virgo, right? So purity and virginity become very, very important. And this is always an interesting conversation on why the Romans valued purity for women so much. There's a lot of not great reasons, as you might imagine. Some are tied, we think, to the Romans' vision of conquest, which gets very violent, as you might imagine. Of that is one image behind the level of purity. As I try to share with my students, the other one is, I think, very, very practical, in that purity gets elevated because of childbirth and the ability of being married and children out of wedlock. And so what I try to work with students is showing them is that the purity concept, although we might kind of balk at that at some level, it is certainly a double standard, as I mentioned earlier. Men are never called Virgos. They're never given Virgo as a kind of moral virtue. In fact, they're advised to do the opposite. But for women, of course, this becomes very, very different. And what I try to share with students is that every sexual encounter, right, carries with it in the Roman world the ability to produce a child. And I think, as I try to share with students, right, it wasn't until very, very, very recently, in terms of human history, that we've been able to sever the link between sex and procreation, right? Outside of the pill, 1958, 59, right? 57, can't remember. Late 50s, right? For much of human civilization, every sexual encounter could bring the possibility of a child. And so I think if that's your horizon, and given the roles of women in inheritance in the Roman world, that really is, in some sense, really going to radically change your life if you have a child out of wedlock. And so I think what that does is it ups the ante in many ways of that kind of consequential nature to the sexual encounter. That if this happens, your life changes dramatically. And it does certainly so, not to make it entirely about that, for the Roman father who's trying to marry off his daughters, right? And so if we think about it that way, it does elevate this concept. It certainly brings it into focus, because in many ways, like today, right, it would be the women raising those children. If the Roman male did not want the baby, and they're not married, he has no social obligation to continue. And so in this sense, the purity virginity concept really amplifies itself. What I find interesting about Paul in this context is that he actually applies the purity concept to Roman men. And this would be the kind of game-changing conversation in the Roman world. If you read in 1 Corinthians, right, he's very adamant that Roman men also practice some form of chastity, right? That they are not allowed themselves to have a double standard. And so when we put Paul's kind of sexual ethics back in their context of the first century, it is rather leveling the playing field when he tells Roman men that what they do with their bodies matters. And this would be a new conversation in the Roman world, because we do have Roman poets and authors writing about Roman men, and some of it's pretty staggering to hear, but there is one quote, I can't remember the author, but I have the quote in my head, that Roman men have their wives for bearing legitimate children, and then they have slaves and prostitutes for their baser needs. And that's kind of the sexual ethic in many ways of the Roman world. So that goes uncommented upon in Roman circles. This is why in 1 Corinthians 6, right, Paul has to have a conversation with Roman men about visiting prostitutes. And he's raising a standard, not lowering it. And so for many in the Roman world, this would be a new conversation. Obviously for Jews, it's not, right? Sexual integrity was right alongside many texts in the Old Testament. But if you think about Roman men, this is new news for them, right? For the first time ever, maybe, right? They're getting official commentary on what they do with their bodies and other people. And so in the Roman world, what he's doing is I think he's applying this concept more broadly. And that's why in some contexts in Paul's communities, the bar is actually much higher for Roman men than it is for Roman women. Because for the first time, potentially in the first century, we're seeing an equal kind of playing field here on this topic. So I usually argue that Paul's not lowering the bar, he's actually raising it. And for many Roman men, this might be a deal breaker. They may back away from the Christian community because someone is actually calling them to account in many ways for how they're doing that. And so this is the way that the purity conversation in the Roman world is just very different. The term purity is never applied to Roman men. This becomes the female virtue equivalent. So if men pursue virtue, because they're vers, remember, women pursue purity as they await to become a matrona. Let me pause it there. Any thoughts, questions on some of that?
Can you go back to contraception that you
Yep.
just mentioned the pill? Can you go back to condoms? Because there we did have before that
Yeah.
in society the break.
Yeah, we actually, archaeology is a wild field. You can find pretty much anything you want in archaeology. So we have found the Roman equivalent of a condom. As you might imagine, probably not all that helpful, right? Because they are making these out of cloth, essentially. Not really going to catch what we're trying to catch, right? And so we do find them, so they are trying to do that, and they use all the typical methods that many people have used throughout history. And that can be effective in some ways, not 100%, right? And so we do have forms of that, but not a lot. So abstaining is the only foolproof way, right, to actually not get pregnant.
So and then how does a woman control her purity?
Control that?
In such a virginity in society.
Yeah, it's kind of a mutual enforced reality in that, again, we see women marked out as virgins. We'll see this in a minute, but Augustus actually levies penalties for sexual assault in the Roman world. And so there are actually jail time and things like that for women who are attacked.
For the man only or the woman?
For the man, in that instance, yeah, which is very rare. That's new in the first century. So there is kind of a mutually reinforced that we're going to protect that. Now again, humans are humans, right? So we have theory, we have ideal. People are going to be people. And so there are ways in which we'll see many are kind of sometimes circumventing those categories because life on the ground is messy, right? But yeah, there are ways in which they want to also keep that because Roman men also want that. And so
what happens to the woman?
If that is gone,
Yeah,
so-
the purity is gone, so now are you cast aside?
one, just to be very practical, it has to be proven. Usually the baby is the one that's going to do it, right? That's the telltale example. Beyond that, no one might ever know if that's a secret that's kept. They're not really doing tests in that sense, like in other periods of history. Really, it's just if a baby's born, then the question becomes, that's a problem. Yeah.
Those stages for women and the kind of dress, like for Virgo, are those for every level of society or only like the upper class? Like would a slave woman go through that kind of stage or not?
Yeah, I think all women are going to go through the stages. Their dress would then be determined by their social status. So, sadly, a lot of the texts we have are commenting on upper elite women. And so sometimes there's open questions on what about the average everyday lower class woman. I think certainly the stages are there of Puella, Virgo, Matrona. How that was distinguished in society, maybe not. But certainly for elite Roman women, they are showcasing this. I'm a potential mate. But also, these are arranged marriages. We're going to move to marriage here in a minute. And so often it's fathers talking with fathers about who's my daughter going to marry. Right? And so they're sometimes being, I would say, matchmakers and putting those things together. So, yeah, it's difficult to know where it cascades onto everyone. But if the Roman elite are doing it, there's probably some form of lower class women trying to embody that. You need to at least mark yourself up socially, right, at some level. of that. If you're, just life stages indicate that, right? Yeah, they're trying to marry off all their daughters, and so now we have the question of what happens if you don't get married, if that doesn't work out. But most people would be married in the Roman world. Yeah.
So, Palestine occupied by the Romans, Mary is pregnant.
Yep.
But still, Virgo, according to
Yep.
Roman standards. Is there anything notable about the Jewish take on this at the time of her pregnancy?
Yeah, I mean, the one line that we get in Matthew's gospel, I believe, is that Joseph tried to put her away quietly. So it comes up that she says she's pregnant, she's having a child. Obviously, ancients know how that works too, right? They're not like, hey, virgin births happen every Tuesday, right? So they just go with the natural conclusion. Mary was not faithful to her betrothed, soon-to-be husband Joseph. And it seems that Joseph wants to take the kind of place of honor and just kind of sideline that conversation. So they're kind of wrestling with that too, that if true, if there was another person involved, then for Mary, this is highly problematic. And it's going to obviously break her marriage, because Joseph says, obviously, it's not mine, right? In that context, hence the putting her away. I think if Joseph had thought it was his, there might have been a way to get married quickly and then just, the baby comes out later. Because again, they don't have pregnancy tests, right? Women would know when they're pregnant, but until they start showing in society, there would be no way. You could keep that information hidden as long as you can, right? And so, anyways, yeah, there would have been ways that they were handling that conversation there in Roman Palestine. I think Jews in general, right, the Old Testament would have a more purity-based ethic, right? That there should that shouldn't happen until marriage for both men and women. Although, obviously, exceptions to that as well. And it's not entirely the Roman view either. I think there's a little bit more wiggle room there. But yeah, they would see that pregnancy out of wedlock is just as damaging, quote unquote, for everyone involved as the Romans would.
And any extra biblical texts that can help us understand how Jews and Gentiles in Palestine would have viewed this that would be any different than anywhere else in the Roman world? For example, dogging Jesus' reputation as a boy and then a man as a function of the circumstances of his birth.
Yeah, one of the first ones, I forget the author, I think it's Celsus, I think that's who it is. One of the first attacks, I think in the 2nd or 3rd century, it's outside the field a little bit, is that Jesus was not virgin born, but that a Roman soldier raped Mary. And that becomes one of the first lines of attack on Jesus' identity, is that he's essentially a bastard child. And the early Christians refute that and say, no, that's not the story. But that becomes one of the first lines is someone had to sleep with Mary. And so they kind of concoct the story that was potentially a Roman soldier moving through the region, which you do have lots of stories like that with Roman soldiers. And so that becomes one of the first explanations, if you will, from the kind of non-Jewish Christian side on what really happened. And again, they pick that up as a line of attack on this growing Christian movement, that the founder, right, actually was just a child out of wedlock. And again, for that, that's social shame, right? That should not happen. And a lot of this is tied into how marriage works, right? So property and inheritance is passed down through bloodline children. And so that's where children out of wedlock, that really messes up the inheritance structure. Hence why you want, and claims on the inheritance, essentially. And so that's why you want children to be born in wedlock. And the Romans have an answer for that, and it's why you get married young. So when we move to female adolescence, what's really interesting is that the Romans, because they believe that women are not guided by reason, they're guided by their passions, their desires, that when adolescence hits, they are basically going crazy. And so you need to get them married, so that if they're going to have sex, at least it will be in marriage. And so they kind of bring two conversations together. Sex should only be in marriage. Young teenage girls are going to be kind of very, very excited. So let's get them married quickly. And then they can have as much sex as they want in marriage. And if children happen, then great. All problems solved, right? Because they believe, and this goes back to that kind of philosophical orientation, that women cannot use reason to guide their passions. Hence, they need an older male in their life to help them them work through issues, and they need to be married young so that they can kind of put everything in the right context. So they actually advise women to get married early, one for the practical reason of bearing children, but two to offset kind of hyper female desire in teenage girls. And so that's their advice, is go get married young, we're gonna solve all of our problems. The practical element, as I mentioned, is true, right? If 60% of your children are gonna die in the first year, and 50% are gonna make it to age 10, and you need to have a family of 4 to 5 to 6 children, you need to potentially be trying for 8 to 12 children, right? Like just practically speaking. Because children are your social safety net in the ancient world. There is no nursing homes, there is no Medicare, Medicaid, there is no hospice, right? The people who are going to take care of you in your old age are your children. And that's obviously how it's been for a majority of human history, right? That's not rare, right? And so you need to have 4 to 6 children to help support you at the end of your life. And if half of them are going to die, then you need to be attempting at least maybe 10 children. So times that out by the months, right? That's why they're getting children married at 14. Now there are debates on when women should have children, whether that's 16 or 18. And some medical texts say at least being 18 years old so that the body can actually carry a child. They're well aware of the effects of bearing children on the human body. And so they are interacting with that as well. So yeah, medical professionals were advising women to get married early. They have a variety of opinions on women's bodies, particularly that the uterus roams around the body. This is actually kind of fascinating. So Plato, the world's leading philosopher, right, actually writes this. This goes into print. He believes that the womb, the uterus, is the animal within, is what he calls it, and that it gets so desirous of childbearing that it gets discontented and angry, and it wanders every direction through the body, causing all sorts of varieties of disease. So that's his thought. Any opinions on that? It's obviously wrong, right? So again, in the first century, they're doing medical dissections of the human body, and they go, oh, oops, I guess we're wrong on that one. And so this changes, but they believe it's called the animal within, and it's called the wandering womb. That basically would wander through the body and have fits, and this would cause women to be, have sicknesses and diseases, and so again, first century medical advice, not entirely helpful, but this is what they believe is happening. And sometimes it's humorous, and it would be more funny if it didn't have such kind of knock-on horrific effects, right, for women, for how this is causing them to be treated. Yeah.
When you're married, so I understand how a female needs to get married, but what's the age of the male? Because like, I'm thinking like in Mormonism, how you have the old guy who's 65 and somehow needs to get another 14-year-old girl. Or if it's a male thing, that I need a young girl.
No, I think, so that usually comes up with this context. So men are usually around the age 30 when they get married, 25 to 30. So they want them to finish their education and go get a job, and then they can get married. And so for Roman men, they need to go through their career, finish their education, go to school, start their first job, and then they can go get married. And so then you have basically 25-year-olds marrying 14-year-olds. And what I say to my students is that's less the creepy factor, although maybe that is there, I don't know, but more the practical element. So we need to start having children as soon as possible because that timeline has got to get going. And so this is why it becomes interesting. A lot of Roman kids would probably grow up without their father. I don't think we think about that because if men are marrying in their 25 to 30, and let's say the lifespan is 40, maybe 50 years old, you're probably going to be living with your mom and your dad might be passed away. This actually makes sense of the Jesus story. If you notice, Joseph is not mentioned outside the birth narratives. He's mentioned indirectly in Mark chapter 3. And so most likely Joseph might have passed away by the time Jesus was a teenager. So we don't think about Mary as, and I want to use this carefully, as like a single mom, but she kind of is. She's raising multiple children, obviously within a family network of like Elizabeth and her cousins, but still, Joseph does not have a father in the home in that sense. That's our leading theory because he's never mentioned outside the birth narratives. And we think he would be, particularly in the text of Mark chapter 3 when Jesus' family comes out to get him because they think he's gone crazy, right? It kind of has the theme of the rebellious son coming out of Deuteronomy. And typically that would be the father's role to go get the son and take him back home. And it's Mary who's leading that. Mary goes to get him. And so we would think if Joseph was around, he would go get him. But he's not. And so Mary and most kids probably grew up without their dad. They certainly did not grow up with grandparents. That would be even more strange, which makes it all the more interesting when we get to someone like Timothy in the New Testament. And it says it was his grandmother and his mother who instructed him in the faith. And so Timothy is kind of the exception to have a living grandmother in the ancient world. Because again, the timelines just aren't going to work out, especially great-grandparents. I mean, that's just not heard of, right? The lifespan of people like today, just to remind us, is tied to social economic status. So elite people are living longer lives because they have better access to nutrition, food, clean water. And those on the lower end are living much, much shorter lives because of the access to all the things that we take for granted today, right? And so, yeah, people would not necessarily grow up with that. So getting married young has these other effects of who's going to be around when you're a male who's grown up to be an adult. Your father probably won't be around, just practically speaking, unless you come from an elite family. I do find it interesting, this is actually really sad through my research, I found that we actually have 0 texts from a mother to a daughter. We have not found any written evidence of mothers writing to their daughters. We have the text like we have of fathers speaking about daughters. It's just one of the sad realities, at least not discovered yet, of what was it like for a mother to have a conversation with her daughter about growing up in the Roman world. We just don't know that. We can make assumptions based on what we know, but it's just one of those weird facts of history. There are no like official texts like that. All right, so Roman women grow up, they get married. Sorry, I have to show this quote just because I find it funny. So Rufus talks about females and puberty, and he gives some advice. So we talked about the role of passions, kind of running crazy. So he advises them at this age, that is the onset of puberty. Rufus is a medical doctor, by the way. He writes a medical text. He says, it is necessary to prescribe to girls long walks, and if there is no impediment, also to run, or to exercise by rolling in the dust. So it's like, all right, if things get out of hand, just go roll on the ground and let it pass. And that's his advice. So again, we want them to do this, but to play, to exercise, to go around. We actually have texts of women exercising in the Roman world. They're playing the equivalent of volleyball here, right? This is Mosaic, where they're playing some sort of athletic game back and forth. I want to show these pictures just because it's Roman people are Roman people, right? They have hobbies and pastimes and things that they're doing here. So young women would get married, they would then have children, and then of course we have Roman marriage in that context. Now, to sum up a long story, and I'm helping serve at the altar today, so we actually do have to end on time, is that Roman marriage is political. Behind me is a famous picture of a famous event in the Roman world called I call it the taking of the Sabine women. It's often called the rape of the Sabine women. And it goes back to the founding of the city of Rome. So if you go all the way back to the founding, the mythical founding of Romulus and Remus, they found the city, they stocked it with Roman soldiers, and lo and behold, no one in the surrounding region of Italia wants to marry a Roman because they think they're low status, they think they're not good for society, and so that becomes a problem. How do you grow a city without people to live in it? And so the Roman soldiers have this festival where they invite the Sabine women, it's a group around this region of Rome, to come to a party. They all invite them to the party, and then they take the women, they kidnap them, right? Take them back, sleep with them, they have babies. And then, as the story goes, I'm summing up a lot here. They come back together, and obviously the brothers and fathers of those women are very upset. They want to go to war with the Romans. And in this story, and you can poke holes through this, the women actually stand up who are taken and say, no, 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 we've actually come to love our Roman husbands. Don't fight with them. Be at peace. There's no reason for bloodshed. That's the story. There's lots of problems with that story, as you might imagine. One version of like Stockholm Syndrome, right? The other version of that that's very interesting for the Romans is it shows that marriage is political. Marriage brings warring parties together and brings peace. And that becomes the fundamental building block of Roman marriage. We marry in the Roman world, in that first century context, because we're establishing political relationships. We're bringing families together to create bonds. All the way up from the emperor marrying off his daughters, nieces, and female cousins to other kings, right? Kind of like that medieval mindset, to just elite Roman families saying, if I marry into your family, our status goes up. And so Roman marriage then becomes, again, it is that stage, but it is the stage that is helping establish social bonds. And so love is not the basis of Roman marriage. We have texts of people loving one another, but that's not the primary reason you get married. You don't get married because you love someone or because you think they're attractive. You get married because your father says this is good for our family, right? And same for the daughter, right? So marriages are being put together in that sense. Again, very different than Western, especially American forms of marriage. I don't think we have had that for a very long time, right? But certainly true in other parts of the world, right? Where marriage is not just a romantic ideal, it's a social product, right? So women are going to get married as matronas to form these political social bonds, and then they are going to begin to have children to even further establish those bonds. As I mentioned, women's education was often connected to status, and so their education only went so far as one, families could afford, but then two, what was going to be their roles in life. And so we do find women being sometimes immensely educated. But again, the end goal for that is to be a good wife. So that you can go to parties with your Roman senator husband, talk with other Roman senators, they mention the Odyssey or the Iliad, and you've read it before, you can make a comment on it, and they go, oh wow, he married someone, really, really fantastic. That's really the goal. And so Roman education is in many ways like a form of like a finishing school, right? And we've had those before in our own country, right? Where the goal isn't the degree, the goal is to be well-rounded, right? Quote, unquote. And that's really how education for women is functioning in the Roman world. It's to help them be well-rounded citizens. But it's not giving them a job. Their job will still be wife and mother, because that's the arc, right? So what happens to women, because there's always exceptions, what happens to women who step outside of that? Well, they get a title. It's called a Virgo Docta. You see our first term there, right? Virgo. This is an unmarried woman who did not get married, but pursued her education. She's a docta, female doctor, right? This is essentially it's kind of a slam. It's not a positive term. It's basically calling her like a learned girl, right? That she pursued her education too far. And that's because the Romans view education as a male-dominated activity. And so for women pursuing their education, they're actually stepping outside of their gender role. They're becoming too masculine. In text, we find that commented, that they're actually taking on masculine qualities. And obviously, I've gone to a lot of school and know that that's sometimes still the trait today, right? Like, what are you doing in this classroom? Why are you pursuing this advanced degree? How are you going to handle your education with being a wife or a mom? Like, these are all versions of that conversation back here that you're essentially stepping into a male-dominated activity and not kind of keeping in your role. So they use this as a slam, but notice this person here, she has a stylus, some sort of codex. She has lots of education. And so it's a rare thing in the Roman world, but there are exceptions of females who said, no, I don't want to get married, I don't want to do that. They probably need a nice elite status to help them maintain that lifestyle, but it is possible. All right, the point I want to end on, and we can probably come back to this next week, because we'll have a couple minutes. So knowing what we know about the ways that women were treated in the Roman world, their expectations, the horizon of their life, I find it interesting, the list of women that Paul works with. So on the screen, you have about 15 to 20 names of named women in the Pauline letters. And it's a pretty long list. And some of the names are rather significant because Phoebe is a letter carrier, interpreter of the letter to the Romans. So she's educated, she can read, she can interpret, she can teach. Junia in Romans 16:7 is called an apostle. She's planting churches, she's leading and doing all the things that Paul did. We have obviously most famous Priscilla and Aquila. Priscilla's name precedes her husband. She teaches Apollos more accurately, it says in Acts, in the way of the Lord. And I want to bring that back into conversation with the kind of narrative arc of women in the Roman world. So if you're supposed to be a virgin and then a mother, certain Pauline texts become rather fascinating in this light because in Romans, I'm a Roman scholar, so it's always Romans. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul actually tells his Roman audience that if it were up to me, I would hope that you remain single. Now notice that the Roman arc is, for women, is young girl, virgin, married. Do you notice what Paul has just done? He actually says, you being married is not the highest calling in your life. Your highest calling is to serve Christ like me. And so I'd actually encourage you to remain single. Now, for Roman men, that might not change their trajectory all that much, but for Roman women, that is actually quite subversive in the first century. Because you're actually asking them to step out of the typical trajectory of all Roman women. And you're saying, don't follow that pathway. Don't follow that career arc. Do something different. Now, the question might be, well, what are all these single women who aren't married going to do? Well, the list shows you. Now, instead of being mothers, they're going to be teachers, church planners, pastors, preachers. There's the work of the kingdom to do. And so what I find interesting in the first century is that Paul's actually carving out this rather radical way for women to pursue other options. Because if they're going to be leading, well, now we need education. If they're not going to be just a mother, they're going to be doing other things in the Roman world. So I think in that context, what Paul models here is actually counter the Roman ideal for Corinthian women. This is not something that their fathers would be telling them. This is not something that their society would be telling them. It would be go get married, go have children, and kind of that's your lot in life. But I would argue that Paul introduces a new trajectory of horizon here for Christian Roman women. That you can be an evangelist, a teacher, a missionary, an apostle, and that doesn't have to be the only thing that you do. What makes this even more fascinating before we move to questions is that in the year 19 BC, 19 CE, this is right at the tail end of Augustus's reign, Augustus introduces the Roman marriage laws. And he actually taxes singleness. So contrary to ours, if you're not married, you actually have a new tax that you have to pay. And by the way, if you're married and you don't have children, you also have a tax because Augustus is trying to grow the Roman base for the army, right? So he actually gives tax incentives for having children. That sounds familiar, right? To grow the Roman family. So what he does is he actually penalizes singleness and he penalizes not having kids. So your tax bill goes up in the Roman world. And so notice, Paul writes about 30 years after that law and actually encourages his Roman women to do the exact opposite of what Augustus is saying. Augustus is saying, get married, have children. Paul says, time out, remain single. Don't get married, don't have children. And so in many ways, he's confronting, I think, this kind of Roman ideal and carving out new pathways for women. Thoughts, questions, we'll kind of end there, but yeah, Solon?
I'm just curious, what if you said that women had children often because they were going to take care of them.
Yep.
What was going to happen to these women?
So that becomes really interesting in the early Christian communities is, you notice, I think it's in 1 Corinthians or 1 Thessalonians, what do we do with young widows? What do we do with people whose husbands have died and it can still at the age of remarrying? So it becomes a real big issue of how are we going to take care of one another? And I would argue what Paul and the early Christians are doing based on Acts 2 and Acts 4, those radical sharing communities are going to have to be broadened now to accompany a social framework for single people. Because, yeah, they're not going to have that at the end of their life. So it's actually going to reformulate how the church thinks about its own economics. And remember, economics in Greek is oikonomia, the rule of the house. How do you set up your house? So all economics is house values. The economics of the Roman Empire, how does the Roman house of the empire run? And so I would argue that Christian house economics have to change because now they have to account for a bunch of single people. So it's going to change the way that they handle their finances. Because now they're going to have, if they're going to live this out, they're going to have to take care of other people who aren't related to them. So I think it radically reshapes all of that. Yeah. Yep.
So that list is all Roman women?
It could be some Jewish women around there, but they're all in Roman context. Yep.
And then so the message you were describing that Paul was giving the Roman women, would the Jewish women have the same future opportunities or
It's-
singleness or?
Yeah, we think Junia is a Jewish name,
Okay.
because there's not a Latin form. If I research reminds me, Mary is probably Jewish. A couple other people on there are Jewish.
Okay.
But these are Jewish women living in Roman contexts. So they're in Ephesus, Corinth, Rome, and so they're kind of intersecting that. So yeah, I think it would apply to both. But it's pretty radical in the first century when you see the context in which Paul is arguing. This is actually quite staggering. Just the number of women he has working with him, I think showcases a different view of women than a lot of Roman men had. Obviously, they're clearly able to be educated. Paul wants them as co-workers, and he's establishing these new kind of pathways there for them. And that is just very, very different than what we see elsewhere. Great.
So Jason,
Yeah.
what you're suggesting is that Paul, writing in 50-something, a Roman citizen,
Mhm.
having a conversation with these women,
Mm-hmm.
encouraging them to engage in a subversive activity amidst the dominant political entity. A great career path.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean the level of subversion is probably just going to be on taxation. I mean it's not like the Romans are calling for the overthrow of the empire, but it is a subtle kind of undercutting of a cultural way of life, and that's going to I think start to have an effect, right? From again the communities that Paul can work with, which are his house churches. He can't change the empire, but he can work with Roman house churches. So on a small scale level, yeah. I mean, the Roman women are going to be hearing two different stories. Go get married, have children. Paul says, serve the Lord. And I would argue that what that does over time, not necessarily in the first century, is that's going to open up new avenues for women going forward. Because what he's doing is he's breaking that link between that Matrona period. And once you do that, well, now we have to have another question. Well, then what are we going to do with all these single women? Well, they're going to need to be educated, and they're going to need to find places to lead, right? And that's going to start in the Roman house church, but then it's going to like bubble out, right? And we do see, by and large, more female converts to Christianity in the first century than we do men. Just by and large, as it gets critiqued, they say it's a religion of the outcast, of women, of slaves, of the poor. It's not attracting elite Roman men for various reasons, obvious reasons, right? Yeah.
When you're saying lead and teach, or it's not just a teacher teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. This is leading
Churches.
churches.
Yep. Yeah, Junia is an apostle. Phoebe's reading Romans aloud to the community in Rome, so she's interpreting the letter to them. So I'd argue they're leading in theological spaces.
And
Um,
she's
yep.
would then be allowed to teach males.
Oh, yes.
Above
Yeah,
the age
yeah.
of 16.
Correct.
Who
Yep.
read-
She's doing more than children's ministry.
Okay.
Yep.
Children's ministry.
Yeah, no,
Right,
if we
thank
take
you.
those titles like seriously, yeah, it's a mixed group and they're educated, which again is probably for some Roman men. I mean, we have texts that they don't like to see women up in public speaking. You find the same thing throughout human history. You look at like the suffragette movement, one of the big challenges was these women are up talking, right? Right? Like they're espousing thoughts aloud. That's fine in your own quarters, but like, so yeah, there would be a lot, I think, for Roman men to adapt to in this new world. But I think for Paul, it goes back to Galatians 3:28, that in Christ and the Messiah, there is no Jew or Gentile, slave or free, nor male or female. You are all equal. You are all one in the Messiah. And again, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, right, we do have Genesis 1 and 2, right? Male and female are created in the image of God. I think Paul kind of brings that forward to a Roman context that doesn't see equality amongst the genders and radically leans into it. And they have the Spirit, right? So Joel 2, quoted in Acts at Pentecost, your sons and daughters will prophesy. These are a lot of daughters prophesying in light of the Spirit being given. So I'd argue that's how Paul's making his theological argument. The Spirit's been poured out on women, and the gifts are not gender-based, right? And so they got to serve. And then I think that takes on social ramifications of, well, if they're going to serve, then they need to have other opportunities. All right, I have to go over and robe up, but